ladies and gentlemen, to the second half of the discussions today, and this is going to be a panel group, as you can see, with the 6 panelists here. Questions will be from the questions sent in, but if you have any particular points you want to raise as we go through the discussion points, do raise your hands. I think we better see you against the lights here. And yes, we'll involve you in the discussion. So this is a big free-for-all. Let's just discuss lots of topics here. So I'm going to chair the meeting, I think, and we'll start off with a question for Michael Tsarion here. And it says, he's halfway through a book here. He's not paying attention whatsoever. Okay, so Michael, it says, can you tell us some good books to learn about the Illuminati?
Yeah, Dr. John Coleman, most of his books, Diplomacy by Deception, Committee of 300, mostly anything by Eustace Mullins, and the Dope Incorporated crowd. This includes Jeffrey Steinberg, Webster Tarpley, Lyndon LaRouche. Lyndon, of course, has many capacities. You may like him, you may not, but his particular thesis, which ties in very beautifully with Dr. Coleman's work on the Tavistock Institute and how many of the British orcs, and again, when I say British, I don't mean you people or me, I mean, you know, the establishment here, how they would work through the Royal Societies, Tavistock Institutes, to move into the American context. Those are essential books because of their scope and their eclecticism, and also the fact that they're they're full of sources. There are other books one could recommend, and people find them listed on the forum and website, but these books are definitive in my reading. They're superior to others. So one could list, a lot of Fritz Spring, bloodlines of the Illuminati, and but again, in this field, you should be as eclectic as possible and try, as James Colonel Bogarde said, get your arms around as much of the information as you can. Don't limit it to one particular author. That'll get you nowhere. You have to be as eclectic as possible and read a wide variety. I always say to people, there are no shortcuts with this. We talked about at the beginning, you have to pick up the slack on your own. And that also means that there really are no shortcuts. You have to go the distance. You have to go into areas that maybe you wouldn't first think of. And, there's many authors here. I mean, Ralph Ellis's work, everybody else's work that is speaking. There's so many facets to this. But those are the ones that right now, specifically, I can think of. If you contact me individually, I can give you more references.
And do you think, sorry, is my mic on still? Yes. Do you think the Illuminati are still influential in the modern world?
Yes, I do. Maybe not under that name, because there are certain names that are generic. There are certain names they use for themselves. So if I go around talking about the Alpha Lodge of British Freemasonry, people scratch their heads. You know what I'm saying? If you talk about obscure groups and obscure orgs and obscure societies, that maybe only referenced in some very fundamental works, hard to find works, then of course people, you're lost and it becomes difficult. So I would say it's an umbrella term, but specifically speaking of that group or that order of elites, and I can be specific about it. The Club of the Isles, like I just mentioned, the Alpha Lodge of Freemasonry. People go to my work, they'll see the breakdown and the specificity there. But the Illuminati should just be considered a term that is a blanket term for a whole network and a matrix of various secret organizations, and then they elect G. Edward Griffin, for instance, is another one I would mention, his work, to show how there's concentric circles of this, how there's inner shell, inner courts, and then outer courts. So Illuminati is just a blanket term to represent that entire matrix or architecture of control, basically.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor on that? Okay, let's move on to Alan. Yes. Yeah.
No, David and I have differences on that. The differences between each of us, Michael, your theories on Atlantis is different than David's. Oh, Michael, your theories on atomism and Akhenaten is different than Ralph. Yeah, it should be. It's up to the reader to go and synthesize all of that work. We're not all going to reproduce each other. And the differences that I would say I have with a lot of people are pretty much microscopic. They shouldn't be put on the first burner. They're important later on, the micro differences. But no, and if you read the Atlantis book, you'll see what the difference is between me and David and the reptilian thing, and we can certainly talk about it later on as well if you want more detail.
Okay, let's move on so we can get all the other panelists in as well. So there's a question here looks like it's directed towards Alan. So it says here, some speakers have shown that British history has been covered up and changed. For what reason do you think this has been done?
Well, there are a couple of main reasons. One, if Christianity arrives in Britain in 37 AD, which it did, and Christianity was set up here, then it went from Britain to Rome. The brand of Christianity that developed in Rome was quite different from the brand in Britain. And the British clergy married and the Roman clergy didn't. And I think it was Irenaeus who went to see the Bishop of Rome about 160 and said, look, you know, all these churches have grown up around the Med in various cities and towns, and they've all got their own versions, and we're never going to be properly believed while we all say slightly different things. We better get organised and all say the same thing. Let's all sing from the same hymn book, Mark. Well, of course, that didn't suit the British at all. In the early councils, the British church was always placed first. When they called a big council of the church, you know, they would always place first because of the original church. And so there was a growing sort of split, as it were, between the British church and the Church of Rome as they developed their theology, you know, because they have developed and changed over the centuries. The real problem arose when comet hit Britain, 562, demolished most of the country, wrecked much of Ireland, all the forests are burned, people are killed, a lot of empty land, in come Saxons and Andals. I don't blame them, they're coming into empty land and they need land, and some Jutes in Kent. And they were heathen, but in two cases, the kings of these people, an Angle and Saxon, were married to ladies who had become Christian, and a Christian, European, Roman Catholic Christian. So, next thing that happened, almost overnight, in comes Austin or Augustine from Rome, and he's preaching their brand in opposition to the British brand. Famous meeting at Ost, where there are 7 bridges now, where he meets with 7 British bishops. They thought he was discourteous, among other things. And he told them they had to sort of bow to Rome, and they said, go and get lost. And it was really the daughter telling the mother to obey, you know, in that sense of churches. And the wars that then followed were just like the war that the Roman Church egged Clovis the Frank to attack the British-style Christians in Gaul and to sort of force them to become Roman Catholics. That's the First Crusade. And the wars that then ensued between the Angles and the Welsh and the Saxons and the Welsh were nearly all religiously motivated to promote one religion and to dislodge the other. Because the attacks on Wales were always aimed at the abbeys and the libraries and the monasteries and the universities that they had. So there was a constant sort of furore of this. Welsh priests went on marrying, and they had children who became priests after them and inherited the church like property. Whatever church they ran, it was theirs. And even in the time of King John, they were still Welsh priests were marrying and having kids who became priests after them. So there was a huge. Have I answered the question? I mean, have I drifted off? So there was this religious divide, as well as a racial, not racial, but people divide, you know, also of Europeans. And this is one of the main problems that beset Britain for centuries.
Maintaining a common history.
Yeah, very difficult.
Yes, well, of course, the other thing, of course, is that history is written by the victors, of course, and therefore you will get one voice at the end, which is the voice of the victor. That happens all the time. So let's move on slightly. We have a question, I think, for Daniel, I think. Well, we could probably actually put this out to the rest of the team as well. But it's talking about architecture, so let's ask Daniel about this one. It says the use of the golden ratio in architecture in Britain. What is the reason for it, and where can we find it?
One of the main things about the use of the golden section, or the golden ratio, in architecture all around the world is that you find it absolutely everywhere. It's not a case of one place or the other. You find it in all of these temples. The golden ratio itself was used because of its relation to the human body. And so you'll find this from the bottom of South America to to the top of Timbuktu and beyond. The real thing there, people are always talking about sacred geometry, and whilst I find it a very valid point, the only two real references that you need in order to make buildings which are both connected to you and the planet is to know your measurements of your own body and the measurements of the Earth. So that golden ratio is different all over the place depending on the size of the people. You'll find that as well. Doorways change in size. So really it's quite an open question, the use of the golden ratio in architecture in Britain would be the same as it was anywhere else. There's an understanding of fractal relation of numbers that would connect you to the building itself, and they were always reflectory, so they were relating one to the other. So it's a very, very broad question. And
it was a pagan idea, wasn't it? The man was a temple of God.
Well, I guess you could say it was a pagan idea, but it was an idea of all men everywhere. The pagan thing is a term placed upon certain systems of thought. But
yeah, but the man was a microcosm of the heavens and the earth, and those
precisely.
ratios were universal because he was a microcosm. I was just going to say that I was talking to him about it was pagan, but it was that ratio represented man, Adam Kadmon, was the microcosm of everything else, and that it wasn't some abstract thing outside of man, that man's body was the prime datum, and that therefore his churches, it's the same way that churches and city streets and cathedrals are based on the zodiac, and that's why you have the obelisks reaching up or pointing up to the heavens, is because it was about terrestrial intelligence, celestial intelligence, coming down to the earth through the clock towers. The whole idea was that there's a symbiosis between heaven and earth, but that man is even more important than that. His dimensions of his physical body were implicit in nature, in the Fibonacci and the way plants grow, so that to me it became just like a symbol of of man being the ultimate temple of God, not an external temple. That's probably why the other temples and the Ark of the Covenant and all of these things bear these dimensions.
And I might add to that as well my own thoughts on a purely practical note. As an architect, you can tell future generations the extent of your knowledge. So we see this, of course, in the pyramids, where they encoded within the pyramids the formula for pi, the formula for the circle, and most of the pyramids are also Pythagorean triangles. So from that we know, of course, that Pythagoras was not the first person to know about Pythagorean triangles, because the Egyptians knew about it long before. So that architect has encoded that knowledge into his buildings, so that we will know it in the future, that their level of understanding included astronomy and a great deal of mathematics. So that is another very practical reason for putting maths into your building.
Also in direct relation to Britain, there was a guy who wrote a very good book on this called Tom Brooks, which is called The Hand of Man. And what he found with his research, after surveying every single Celtic site around Britain, but focusing on the southwest, with it being the epicenter of Avebury, Stonehenge, Stanton Drew, all of these very, very sacred sites, was that you had Pythagorean triangles were obviously being used by the earliest Celtic peoples also. And his work really shows that, because he spent 40 years surveying this. He was a surveyor and a draftsman, so he drew all these maps himself, and he showed, just rubbished the idea that the Pythagorean triangle is actually a Pythagorean concept. It's a system of measurement that has been used since time immemorial, it seems.
There was a large Pythagorean triangle is actually encoded into the layout of Stonehenge. And if you divide the measurements up into megalithic yards, it's a perfect Pythagorean triangle. So that shows you the age of that knowledge.
In regards to the megalithic yard, for those who are interested in the thesis I work with about the west to east movement, the purest form, the most accurate form, when Professor Alexander Thom and the people who were the original mappers of this phenomenon, the megalithic yard, they found that the purest and most accurate renditions of it were further west you went. Again, in a little anecdote, maybe contradicting the idea that culture and civilization moved from the east, because it's the further west you go,
ultimately to Ireland, is the oldest version of the megalithic yard and the most precise. That's on the Irish Origins website for people who want to follow that up.
Well, Alexander Thom started his work up in the Shetlands, didn't he, up in the north. And he also proved that they knew how to square the circle. They actually knew how to square the circle. And they also had a geometry of sort of two overlapping circles. That none of these circles are circles, they're egg-shaped. And it's perfect mathematics. I was in America talking to his son about this. But when you're on about measurement, the system of measurement was 3 thumbs make 1 palm. 3 palms make 1 foot. 3 feet make 1 step. 3 steps make 1 leap. And 3 leaps and so on. That's the system of measurement. That's how they did it. And that's how you get the megalithic yard.
That was my exact point.
Down.
Absolutely.
And it's not in Ireland, but it's in Wales, but I don't dispute the Irish may have been first. But
When I say that, when I use the word Irish, and for future questions, I do not mean the way we interpret it today. I mean the Irish, who was primordial people all over Britain.
well, yes, and then none of them were Celts, by the way. So no, but that's how the measurement started. And if you try it on yourself, you'll find it works. Crazy. Of course, if you're a big man with a big hand, you can't sell apples. But if you're a little man with a little hand, you get away with murder. Okay.
Okay, moving on slightly now towards more of the spiritual side, perhaps, for perhaps Leo and Neil, I think, this particular question. How can we stay positive while living under regimes like the Illuminati and Bilderberg?
Well, it's our own journey, and we each within us, we have the Illuminati within us, and we have the enlightened within us. We have all things within us. The first thing we need to struggle with is the kind of Illuminati self-destruct, self-denigrate, negative power, that kind of energy. We have to look out for what is within us, because what is within us is what we have to work with. What is outside, the external world, is a set of mirrors within which we are here to learn and grow. Now, we've had, as we talked this morning, we've had a church for a number of years which had the ability to send its thugs round, the Inquisition. We never got to that this morning, but licensed thugs in cassocks. The church was able to do a complete genocide on the Cathars. The Illuminati of today are not able to do that. The Illuminati of today are struggling with all sorts of things, and I'm sorry, I reckon they're a bunch of rather scared people. And thank you. Glad to hear that. I really encourage relaxing and watching as they struggle against the powers and the tides of evolution which are in the process of having a good go at wiping them away. And also, it's good to remember they are people too. They're human beings. They have wives, husbands, children. You know, they're not monstrosities. Well, I'll leave that open. But they're still human beings. They're an aspect of us.
Can I interject there and ask a question then from you, Leah? How about this for a thought? We have a better standard of living and more freedoms living under their regime than any other people across the world. So is everything they do actually evil?
No. No. If you look at the motivations, I was looking at it would take a little map. It would take, I think it's 3.5 or 4.5 planets for everybody in America requires if the whole world lived as the Americans do. And it would take about 2.5 planets if everybody in the world lived as we do here. The West is incredibly rich. The West is on the verge of becoming incredibly poor because fundamentally Europe and America are bankrupt. It's only printed pieces of paper that hold it away for a bit. So, No, they are people who want a heavy-duty, big standard of living, and they're happy. Well, no, they're happy. That dumps it out again. We inherit a certain amount of things when we come in. We inherit a culture. And the fact that a culture here lives on the backs of sweated labour on the other side of the world is out of the consciousness of most people. As a human race, we have a lot to do to find a sense of equality and unity. We have a long way to go. We go from crisis to crisis, empire to empire, catastrophic war to catastrophic war, and we keep trying to learn. We've got a long way to go. And we need to keep on the road.
And Neil, your thoughts on this?
My view of it is that we are the shadow, and that any manifestation of what at the close zoom level appears to be evil or destructive behavior is confusing when you're too close to it. If you know the boot is on your head, you feel it pretty fast, pretty quickly. If the tyranny is more removed and is of a different nature, i.e. psychological or energetic, then it's more subtle in how it behaves. So the difference between 1984 and Brave New World is that in 1984 it is clearly a boot in the face, it's a club on the back of the head. In Brave New World, the tyranny is consensual. The tyranny is complicit in everything we do, and it is a choice that is made by the people who take part in that. So I would say that the more we disavow our own shadow aspect, the more we disavow the stuck energy within us, there is a danger that this externalization is put off, is created as a separate adversary, a bad guy that we can rail against. There is no bad guy, there is just us. And as long as we continue to disown this shadow self, which is not evil, is not destructive, is part of a cycle like night and day, the more this externalization manifests and becomes the dictators, the elitists, the globalists, the Illuminati, whatever. But actually it's us, and I agree with Leo that without working within, those energy patterns cannot be resolved because they do not exist ultimately outside of us, they emanate from within us. So it's kind of like a representation of the sorry state of affairs of a lot of human beings in their own consciousness, that the ridiculous, transparent nature of the dictatorships that oppress our societies are as bad as they are. It's a representation of how much work we have to do. In this conference, in this room today, it's good, it's optimistic, it's hopeful, it's excellent. Walk down the streets here in Bath and things feel different. So it is about consciousness. It's not about politics, it's not about society. They are the end manifestations, they are the symptoms of what happens way down the line, which begins within.
I think that that's perfect, brilliant. And also in your talk you pointed out that if man doesn't take up his sovereign duty, then a kick up the arse is the only thing that will do it. So you could look at these people that if we didn't have some sort of adversarial aspect in our lives, and I don't even mean on the higher level of the fractal, even in the most interpersonal and domestic situation, we'd be looking for our surfboard and just having a ball. And then again, you become a flatliner in your consciousness. You know, I don't need to be Schopenhauer to tell you that, you know, without suffering, life has no meaning. And we can argue that point to the nth degree, but unbelievably, it's a fact. Because the unconsciousness and the vacuity and the delinquency that you see, as you say, is partly responsible for that. That we have so much affluence provided by the masters, because they know that, you know, chains of gold work just as good to enslave the slave as chains of iron. And that's the only thing that's changed over the centuries of the history, although they're not incapable of taking more sterner measures, as the gentleman at the end pointed out about, you know, Leo, all around the world they're still doing that. But the point, the spiritual aspect of it is, of course, if you are doing your soul work without the catabolic source, right? If you don't need it, and you're doing your soul work, then the adversarial energy will be less around you because you're doing your homework of your own time, which I assume people here are doing. For the rest of mankind who are negating that, they're living in absence of being, then nature, the spirit that is, will provide the adversary in exactly the same way the body does it by producing disease. So the disease that's in the body politic is no different a pathogen. And I've said umpteen times about the whole idea that even the ego is the grave that rose, from the grave of the self. And that if you see maggots around, if you leave meat out for X amount of time, expect maggots. If you sewage and you don't clean it up, expect rats. So it is by the negation of man's selfhood, his being, or what religious people would call the soul, and basically negating all of that, that I believe that these pathogenic forces have arisen, and these tyrannies have arisen. And the original question was, how do we live with it, while it's happening under that form of tyranny? One is realize you're the origin of it individually. Two is realize you're never going to change it unless you have the education. Before the enlightenment and the revelation, you must start with the education. And that's what this level of work, what we're doing here, is all about, and the collaboration that goes with that. So the education is also fundamentally important, so that the doctor knows if the complaint is of the heart, don't be, fixing the brain. Be able to identify the problem, first of all, diagnose it, and that takes a certain level of expertise and education. And that's what this is all about. And then you can treat the right disease with the right cure. So it's a multiplicity of different aspects, but it's a very important question.
Anything from the audience on this? Any questions? Yes?
To start off, you said it's a better quality of life. Do you actually think that we've got a better quality of life? Because we live longer, but, it's just, if you're age 12...
Okay. The question is... Sorry, can you turn my mic up, please? If you can just leave my mic on all the time, please. The question from the floor was, do we really have a better quality of life just because we live longer and are richer? Any answers?
No, I don't think we do. Excuse me. Yeah, I don't. It's all. First of all, it's relative. If you grow up in Calcutta, the answer is yes. If you grow up in Biafra, right, then the answer is yes. So it's all relative. And ultimately, it's not what you have, it's the way you relate to what you have, right? The finest men and the freest men have been in dungeons, lived in dungeons most of their life. But here, attitudinally, they were free and enlightened souls. So what you have is almost immaterial. You can live in the most decadent and affluent societies and still be absolutely in your center and a true person, Or you could live in the most hideous situations, war-torn, families murdered, and still be absolutely in touch with what is real. So it's about the way that you do things, not so much the what of what you have and all of that.
Yeah, I was going to say... Hello, there we go. Yeah, I was going to say that if you consider Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if you're at the basic sort of physiological level of needing food and shelter and warmth, then, someone who lives in sort of communist China in the 50s who would come here would think this is paradise. So many choices, options, food readily available, transport, it would seem like a sort of utopian society. As you move up those hierarchy, though, as you get to the psychological, as you get to self-actualization, only from that point of view, as Michael indicates, can you see the poverty that we live in. It isn't physical poverty, it's emotional poverty.
Also, I would add as well that perhaps with a lot more people it's a subconscious thing, but the majority of people, even the most uninformed, are aware that the reason that we get things cheap is because somebody else is getting it very, very bad somewhere else. Leo's already talked about this, but the subconscious effect on the emotions and the psyche and perhaps the spiritual body of people, even if they're completely unaware of this on many levels, I think that's a real sign of poverty, as Neil was mentioning as well.
Yes, I've written about this myself on many occasions because I delve into economics as well. Under our recent political regime of the last 10, 15 years, we have reinvented slavery. A slave doesn't have to be next door or in the back of your shed to be a slave. A slave can be across the world in another country. If they have no freedom and they have no reward for their labours, they are still slaves. So we have reinvented slavery. And we are living off it. Every good that you buy that comes out of a cheap labour sweatshop from India or China, that is using slave labor. You are using slave labor. Some 6,000 Chinese miners die every year to provide you with cheap goods. So, as I've said before, all of that red ink that they like to put on their packages every time you buy something from China, that is the blood of Chinese people.
Yeah.
No, go now.
I don't. Just one fundamental thing to remember is that the experience of life we actually have is all inside us. The outside is the play. But ultimately, we only experience things from within us. And that's where we live, and that's where we need to put our energy. From that, we can then live in the outer world and do our best to fulfill ourselves.
Yeah, as an extension to that, personally I wouldn't think that the corporate sharecroppers of Wall Street or London are any less a slave than some of the people perhaps in these poorer countries. This is the real thing that's going on. This is emotional and psychological slavery. And it goes much beyond your apparent rate of living. Excuse me. So yeah, to take it purely to physical manifested objects, or the money that you seem to have, the house that you seem to live in, this is about a lot larger question, and slavery is rife in our world.
Okay, let's liven up the argument. We're all getting rather depressive here.
Yeah.
So let's go back into history. Okay, let's have a look at a piece of history. This is a question for myself, if I may ask myself questions. So this is someone called Alex, question for Ralph. Could you elaborate on the Excalibur story? And how does it fit in with my presentation? So I suppose actually this is slightly for myself, maybe for a touch for Alan as well. Because as you saw from my talk, I was linking the Arthurian legend in with Eastern history, with Judea and Syria, linking it with the story, the New Testament story. And I think the story of Excalibur is no different. So I'm thinking here, just for a minute, the sword in the stone story. Excalibur was actually in the Vulgate cycle, it's called Caliburn, it's not called Excalibur. And Caliburn is actually a Hebrew word, which means sword. So we know perhaps the direction in which this sword actually came from. Now, in slightly later eras, 3rd century, about 220 AD, there was this strange emperor that came from the east, Nazarene, called Elagabalus. I'm not sure if you've heard of him. He became emperor of Rome in about 220 AD. He was a priest of the Elagabal. I'm not sure if you've heard of that before. The Elagabal was the sacred stone. And the sacred stone was, most people think it was a meteorite. It was a magnetic meteorite. And Elagabalus took it to Rome and housed it in a special new temple he built in Rome. And it was worshipped there by him and his immediate courtiers. Now, this was a magnetic stone. And you can imagine, if it was highly magnetic, if you put a sword against this magnetic stone, it would get stuck on the magnetic stone, and you would not be able to withdraw it. But if you were clever, and you had a non-ferrous sword, you could put your non-ferrous sword against the stone and you could withdraw it very easily. And I think perhaps this is the origins of the sword in the stone story. What happened to this stone? We don't know. Elagabalus was kicked out as emperor. He was murdered after about 7 years or so. And the Elagabal, the sacred stone, goes missing. And the Elagabal, I have to add, was linked very strongly with the phoenix as well. And it goes missing. They think it went back to Syria. I'm not so sure. I think it was something to do with the Temple of the Zodiac I was talking about in the temple, sorry, in the fortress at Diwa in Chester. I think it might have been housed there because the story of the sacred stone, of course, is Arthurian. If you look at Parseval, the Grail in Parseval, the Grail has many manifestations. Obviously, it was the bloodline, it was the womb of Mary Magdalene, the bloodline of Jesus. But in Parseval, it's also a stone, a meteorite, a stone that fell from the heavens. And I think in Parseval, obviously, you've got another later mention of the Elagabal, the sacred stone of Elagabalus. And I think it probably ended up in Britain, something to do with the fortress at Diwa, and it's from these legends perhaps that we get the stone of Scone from Scotland, which is essentially the same stone. So the history of this sacred stone is very, very difficult to discover. It's very elusive, but I think that is probably what happened to it. We know it was in Rome, and it's recorded in many of the chronicles of Rome that it was in Rome in 220 AD. What happened to it after that, we really don't know. Alan, have you anything to add on that?
Well, I deal with the history and not with the romance stories. So I'm a little bit prejudiced against romance stories. I regard them as the first version of Hollywood history, you know. Make it up as you go along. There's no guarantee that the stone in Rome was magnetic or meteorite. That's conjecture.
Well,
it's conjecture.
Well,
there's no guarantee that it went back to Syria, and there's no guarantee on record that it's in the UK.
Yes.
So you pile one conjecture on another and another, and we've got a house, we're building castles in the air here. All I can say, there's one strange thing that we found on the way up to St. Peter's Church on a mountain in Wales. The old road goes up. It's very, you only need low cloud. It's about 900,000 feet up, and you can't see anything, and it's misty. You can get really, really lost. And there was a great stone on the side of the road, and it was shaped exactly like an anvil. And I mean, someone had shaped this, it's nearly the length of this table, exactly like an anvil. And inside of it was carved a sword, going right down, beautifully carved sword into this anvil. The point is, if you were lost and you got behind it and you looked along to the point of the anvil, that's where the church is. You can go straight there. And we photographed it and one thing and the other. The farmer has turned it over on the side so you can't see it anymore, because there were so many people going up there to see it. He'd find half his sheep down on the main road, you know. 200 sheep around the field, because people didn't shut the gates and things like that. But there is an anvil-shaped stone that has been shaped by man, and there is a sword carved in the side of it. And we said, well, that's as near as we're going to get to a sword and a stone, you know, and I don't know what to make of it. The other thing I'd say is that an English lady, an academic, noted that some of the legends were very close. Matter of fact, they were replicas of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The great Epic of Gilgamesh from the ancient world was the story, you know. He's the king of Uruk, was it Uruk? And he has a mate, a friend in Enkidu, and they are like Arthur and Lancelot, you know, both powerful warriors, and Enkidu gets killed, which saddens Gilgamesh, and he goes off on a quest to find the exit of life and so on. But she noted that there were several aspects of it which were identical to the Welsh Mabinogi's tales. And we said, and dead right. Here you've got these ancient Mabinogi tales, and they are the Epic of Gilgamesh with different names. And also other Sumerian and ancient, we're talking about 2,000, 2,400 BC tales that have been dug up and put together, you know, by archaeologists over the years. And so there are definitely very strange links with ancient Far Eastern, Syrian and Euphrates civilizations. And in that, my colleague is right. And it could well be a link in that direction.
Well, I have to just add, of course, that the Elagabal was said to feed off iron. Iron was its food, which is why everybody thinks it was magnetic.
There's, in the earliest settlers of Ireland, in the very primordial times, the High King, whose name can be pronounced in a variety of ways, we pronounce it Nada. His sword, you know, sword is a very distinctive thing. So it's quite easy to trace these swords of power. And his sword was called Retaliator. and it was picked up in fiction because they say in the legends of ancient Ireland they talk about this, that this sword had the power to vibrate in the presence of evil, and if it ever left the king's side, only then he could be killed, etc., etc., etc. Or that the sword also gave him the power to fight in a pan-dimensional capacity as well, or in other dimensions. As long as he had the sword, he was king, and he also was protected, and he also could fight all sorts of unseen enemies. And that sword was called Retaliator, and I personally believe that was one of the prototypes of Excalibur. But the sword is very, very important in this primordial megalithic tradition of Ireland, because the actual suits of the tarot, which also include a sword, right? The sword, the pentacle, and the wand, and the cup, are found in the earliest myths of Ireland. They're part of the 13 wider treasures of Britain, but they're known as the 4 treasures of Ireland, and they're identical to the tarot suits. It's the earliest, way before Egypt. It's the earliest reference to anything that would be those suits, and of course the sword was one of those suits. But one other little point about this conjecture thing, that, and the idea of romance, that was the little bit of conflict here. So much information has been hidden. Like you said, the man turned the stone the other way around, so, you know, something would happen. Well, the base stones of the Brook and the Boyne, right, at Newgrange, have all been deliberately turned face in, so people can't see the pictographs and hieroglyphics there. And that's just an example I'm giving you of the fact that the establishment has hidden so much factual information, where none of us would have to have conferences like this. It would be a no-brainer what's going on in the world. Conjecture is that sort of Conan Doyle way of jumping the gap. That's what we have to make do with. You have to be imaginative. You have to be, the conjecture is what we now have to build the bridge between the beads that are all over the floor and no thread. So never doubt your imagination or your intuition at all, because yeah, it would be a perfect world, wouldn't it, if no information was ever concealed from us and we could just go to absolute factual information. Unfortunately, we can't do that, so then we have to fall in love with that other realm of intelligence, that ancestral reservoir, which children, of course, have until it's knocked out of them. And we need to recalibrate that, because although it may be less formal and less organized than what we laughingly call fact half the time, it still can serve the same purpose. And we, again, as part of the earlier question about what can we do, is linking back to that ancestral flow of intelligence, and whatever you can do, whatever it is for you, through music, through dance, through yoga, through whatever, is to get in touch again with that organic flow of intelligence. And then you will be beyond even the realm of what other people might need as fact and so on. You will have your knowledge, you'll have your knowing, which is a totally different thing, as the gentleman was showing yesterday about the difference between that feminine knowing, the ancestral knowledge, and then the other thing, which is the masculine paradigm of having to have the facts and then the consensus and all of that, peer review, stuff.
Okay, any thoughts from the floor on this? Any questions? Okay, no hands, so let's move on. What should we have? Oh, I'm sure we've got one for Michael here. Some of these are a bit too long, I think. Do you share the view of Jordan Maxwell, who, when recently asked in a Project Camelot interview about what he thought of the future of mankind, do you share his views? I don't know if you know his views.
I'm not really sure of that particular anecdote. Who wrote this, and what was the anecdote? What did he come across with?
He said essentially that he didn't have high hopes for mankind and future mankind, because the masses were generally dumbed down to an extent that they couldn't really fight what you call the war of consciousness. And he said he hoped that he was wrong, eventually, as we said.
Okay.
Do you have a more optimistic view of what future mankind?
Well, you and me are Irish, so we're habitually pessimistic about tomorrow, but optimistic about the day after tomorrow. So that's the answer. And I think, but to be more serious about it, oh by God, if consciousness is left at the door, which I tend to think is happening, yes, then we have to be realists and go, but at the same time, there is a turning of the tide now, where consciousness and the understanding of our personal responsibility in all of this, and not finger pointing, it's them, it's over the hill. If we can turn that corner, then the whole game changes. This was pointed out in Professor Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, in which the most insignificant, smallest, lowest level of society has the biggest effect. can do things that powerful wizards cannot do, right? And if it was good enough for Professor Tolkien to believe in that, it's all right for the rest of us to believe in that. They can't win because, I've all said in my other metaphysical work, evil contains within it the seeds of its own destruction. And one really needs to meditate on that deeply and also see it applied in your own life, with the tossers that surround us and other evil injustices that are done, even in plain view. Watch that experience. Watch what happens to a person that who's evil and ruthless and negative. Just observe it. And you'll notice that this is in fact the case, and it's certainly the case up the fractal. Evil contains within it the seed of its own destruction. The moment that you take that kind of anti-human negative stance, you're just waving a red flag to nature, go come and get me, which is exactly what's happening now. It's called the age of revealing and the age of awakening. All the message that somebody like me can give is, can you please get into the spirit of that? Because it's happening anyway. And you can either get into sync with it, or you can just sit there and be smashed when the river takes a turn. Your ego boat, right, will be smashed. Can you let go of the shores, like the Hopi prophecy says? Can you let go of the oars and go with that flow? Because it's a very dynamic flow, and it will handle it. What happens with us is that we think, oh my God, what's little old me going to do? It's really difficult, and then it becomes like you're suddenly taking it personally, as if your ego is going to be able to run out there like in the old days, grab a sword and do something about it. We have no capacity in that realm. It's a mixture between tremendous responsibility and self-awareness of it, but at the same time the ability to, as Neil was saying, go yin. Let go and let the higher force guide you, because without that guidance, you're pottering around is like a kid with a giant sword, playing games. A higher form of guidance and a higher form of strategy takes care of this. It doesn't mean abnegate your responsibility, but it means try to always remain with your head in the clouds but your feet on the ground. This is both a physical war, but it's also a psychic one. And the guidance that comes to you is the most important thing, and it will show you where to go and what to do about it. And that kind of particular guidance I'm talking about is not the same kind of sorcery that the Black Lodge has. They have high intelligence, and they have tremendous human knowledge about us on the most fundamental levels. But they lack that connection to the higher intelligence. And that's their ultimate downfall, together with what I said about evil having the seeds of destruction within it. You choose that road, and you will be terminal. You choose the organic, living, feminine, flow of the Tao, and no matter what tyrannies exist in the world, no matter how things get bleak, even if things get 10 times as bleak as they are now, worse, like a prison planet, really and truly, as long as you're with that flow, you're in your center, and it doesn't matter, you see. So it's all about where you are, and they can't inhabit that place, which is why they want dominion, right, over the world. If you can't rise yourself, what's the next best thing? Push everybody down. You're actually remaining exactly where you are, but you've done a good job, like the teachers and bastards we have to deal with every day. They're going to, push you down, and then they feel mighty high. Well, that's what the Bushes and Obamas and the Stalins and all do. They cannot rise themselves, and we have to understand this. They're static spiritually. And the moment that you start doing your spiritual homework, the moment that you do your spiritual homework, you are then on the road to victory. That's the basic way I see it.
And any other comments?
Yeah, I'd like to just add, on a more local level, I've worked with people as a shamanic practitioner, psychotherapist for 25 odd years, and I watch people struggle with stuff as they come out, as the heart opens, they come out with their own truth, and so on and so forth. And in most cases, particularly working with people over a year course or something like that, see people flower as they come to a more whole understanding of themselves and what their life's about. But every so often I have had the sad time of watching somebody come to a confrontation basically with themselves. It might be enacted with another person, but it's basically with themselves, and not go. And the negative within them wins. And then they implode. And it's a very sad thing to see, but that's the local level of what Michael's saying. And it's our job to work with our own stuff and our own issues and to keep going regardless and go through. Oh.
Next question, yes. Anyone else? Yes.
Well, I think I get what he's saying.
Okay.
Just say a few words about it. I showed a clip the other day about the collectivism. It was a logo, corporate logo, in which person's sense of identity is entirely based on the social persona. So this is where the Black Lodge wants us to be, where you have, or let's put it this way, any sense of self that you do have is basically a collectivized sense of self. That's the herd. They've already you're already doing the work for them then. You know, and they don't need to do anything more except impose, you know, the chains of gold upon you if you're not able to really connect with what it is that makes you unique. We all know what it is that makes us the same as everybody else. Our names, our philosophies, even the work that we do. You say you're a taxi driver, well, 10,000 people can say that. You know, what makes you really real? If you stood up and said, well, I'm the man who cares about being, I'm the man who cares about meaning, how many will say that? As Nietzsche and Heidegger and these people have said. But the rest of us goes, well, you know, I paint the walls, or, you know, I drive a bus. There's an inauthenticity implicit in that collective herd, and it's stepping out of that into your individuality. Knowing who your enemy is on the physical level, you know, and realizing what they're really about. They're not really about imprisoning you. Somebody talked about affluence earlier. That's right, they don't mind giving you all the affluence. That's not the problem. Their problem is control of your mind and the dumbing down of your individuality. That's where the prison lies. It's an internal psychic one. And the only way for you to handle that is to do what you need to do from your inner self, right? That's absolutely know thyself. And a point will come where you will have to then differentiate yourself from every other creature on the face of this earth. Maybe not the animals, because that was spoken of in other lectures about asking the animals for their power, you know, to lend. Let's not even go there. From the human point of view, it may come to the point where you have so transcended them, the mass, the herd, the das Man, that yes, you feel that you stand alone in the world. Now, do you know why so few people take this road? It's because that's very hard and painful to do. Right? The road to selfhood is very difficult.
The question we asked were, if you could take on the karmic responsibility of the Illuminati, would you do it? And if so, are you not doing it?
We're already doing it. Karma is nothing more than ignorance. Dharma is knowledge. Dharma is awareness, right? Ignorance is what they're in. They're in a form of ignorance. Like I said, they've chosen a road, and ultimately, metaphysically speaking, that's a road of ignorance. By sharing the ignorance, or being under the force, under their dominion in any sense of the term, right, which is ultimately meaning that you believe everything they're saying and you don't think for yourself, then you are in a state of karma, as worse than theirs or whatever. You can't measure it. Ignorance is ignorance, regardless if it's on a massive scale, right, of Big Brother, or on your individual scale. You know, the time has come now, though, for the human race to wake up and grow up. And there's a sovereignty and individuality involved in that. Let's go with it. Let's enjoy it. Let's be grateful for the fact. You know, raise a glass of wine in your garden and celebrate the fact that now has come the final time, either because of the affluence, either because of the historical period we're in, or because the tyrants have changed their tactics, whatever. All of that is pertinent. But the same fact remains that some other historical action is taking place, in which the world now, through the internet and through whatever, is getting this kind of information. Celebrate that. Be very grateful for that. And at the same time, always, always, always congratulate yourself for coming as far as you do. It'll negate the pessimism that you may have, you know, and it will really give you enthusiasm to carry on in the future.
If I can just add something to that. I think the idea of separation is very confusing with this. If we see everything as distinctly separate entities, you fall into the trap of, you know, thinking somebody's doing something to us, or we have karmic responsibility for other things or whatever. I think if we entertain the premise that there is no separation, that there is just one huge flowing movement, what David Bohm called the hollow movement, and any forms that arise within that, whether it's an apple or a human being or a galaxy, is just a temporary, transient form, then you have a choice. You can either spread a virus through that system, or you can spread music through that system. You can spread darkness, or you can spread beauty. So I think once you understand that everything you do affects everything else, then the consciousness you bring within yourself is the most elegant and beautiful way you can affect everything around you, because everything emanates from within.
Thank you. Okay, well, we've had a philosophical discussion, so let's move back to history again. Let's alternate a little bit. So we have a question probably going out towards Dan, I think. Probably Dan and Alan.
Probably a few people on the panel that would have something to say.
Well, yes. Actually, I don't know much about this guy, so there we go. It says King Bladud, the founder of Bath, is said to be the 9th ruler of Britain, counting number 1 as Brutus. Do the members of the panel believe these two personages should be entered in the column marked legend, or the one entitled reality, or some other column?
I think definitely we'd have to go in the other column, or both, and the other. Because when we're talking about these histories, they were written so long ago, they've gone through successive translations, they were rewritten by groups, either closer to the period, or perhaps longer away from. King Bladud, the majority of the information that we really have on him, and his so-called earlier progenitor Brutus, which goes back to Aeneas, which is also something I know Alan knows a lot about, is said to be connected to the fall of Troy and the incoming of a whole lineage of kings from that direction. But the majority of the writing that we have on this, at least in the modern arena, is from a Catholic priest called Geoffrey of Monmouth. And there are some backings up of this history coming from different sources, which I know Alan will talk about. But from the majority of the information that is widely known about King Bladud and is attributed to Bath, and as Britain as a whole, under his leadership, is kind of a skewed history. But I'd like to hear Alan's thoughts on this.
Study British history from early sources. We would never go near Geoffrey of Monmouth. So if you think he's the only source, then wow. Bladud is believed to have invented hang gliding, running off a hill. You know, we do it today. And he had the idea of hang gliding, running off a hill and trying to fly like a bird. Probably he saw birds like an albatross or anything running, and a duck will run across the water and try to take off, you know. But he invented hang gliding and got himself killed. Something went wrong. So that a man would have thought of hang gliding, I don't find that hard to believe. The Brutus story is not a legend, because Brutus has got a grave. So unless it's empty, then there's something wrong. He's in the songs of graves, and this is a grave.
And what about Bladud?
Well, you know, there's also a statue of Brutus in Rome and so on, an inscription, which is in British Galbraith. But Bladud, you see, if you get a line of kings and you can prove that one and that one and that one, the ones in between have to be believed as well. You can't have a son who didn't have a father or a grandfather. And if you find a great-grandfather, well, he must have had a father. So you don't have to prove the entire dynasty. So there are numbers of lines, and the Brutus dynasty spread one line in Wales, one line in southern England, and one appears to have been in the Midlands. So you'd have more than one son, and would also have more than one son and daughters who would intermarry. And I think the thing is pretty solid that there was a dynasty, because these people who were alive in a time of when the Romans attempted to get into Britain were certainly around, and therefore their ancestors must have been around. You follow that one?
Yeah, well, can you give us an idea, because I know nothing about Bladud, so can you give us an idea about when he lived, what his achievements were, what was going on at that time?
He would certainly be probably around 250 BC, something like that. And Britain was a developing country, you know. It's the same way as the people went to America and they built log cabins and they built tracks and roads and they finally did this and that, and society developed. That, if you read the Welsh king list, they say which king did what, and you can see a cultural development coming through with different developments in building and road making, and each one is adding something to the one before.
Where would you say, Alan, that the Welsh king list actually comes from? Where would be the source material for that to be taken?
The best sources are obviously Welsh sources.
Such as?
Well, there are 6 histories in the Bavarian archaeology. The genealogy of the Glamorgan kings is a prime source. It's the genealogy of Justin, son of Aurelian, Iestyn ap Gwragedd, goes right back to Brutus.
And these were written by, just for people's reference?
Bards, local bards, you see. The problem in Britain is that things rot and fade, and you get worms and woodworm and bookworm and one thing, and there's a fire or a raid, and so they had to keep copying things. And that's why when you find some of the copies, you find they're slightly different to the other copies, you know. Brutes of England were written in about 4 or 5 different main monasteries. So if there was a battle, one lot would write 2 or 3 lines about it, another abbey would write a whole page about it. And so the Brutes of England exhibit sort of a difference that makes them credible. They're not all the same. And the same is with the Welsh documents. And they were nuts on genealogy. You know, I've quoted the 3 Harleian 3859 document, right? The British Museum A14, and but the trouble is there are thousands of them. They're not one or two documents. There are thousands. There's like 14,000 documents, mainly all the same with slight variations, but they exist, and they're piled up in the libraries. Nobody goes near them. The old Yola Morgana who got criticised, Edward Williams. There's 23,000 pages of his documents. He used to go around copying all the other documents, you see. That's what he did. He copied the ancient documents. And wherever he stayed, he said what inn he stayed in, who the landlord was, and what they had on the menu. Every day of his life, he called it who was in the village and what the house was there, and then he went on to the next place. And this stuff exists. But it's generally been wise to sort of push it aside and pretend it's not there. And as long as they can keep pretending it's not there, it's not going to get examined. What we do is to try to, well, I'm diverging. Where would you find it? Mavernian archaeology, genealogies, masses of genealogies, lives of the saints. Every saint got married. So if a man married a woman saint, well, women saints as well, then her father was named and her grandfather and so on, right? And his father and so on. And when a female saint married a man, it was the same thing. So you then are able to build up a matrix. Now, it was very difficult to do this before the advent of computers. Now it would be a piece of cake, getting them all sorted out, you see. So the evidence is there in abundance. You get the Brucken of Brecon had 3 wives and 36 children, 24 daughters, 12 sons. There were 3 Bruckens, all of whom had a wife. Right? One's living around the year 380, the next one's living around 480 to 560, and the next one's around 600. So if you think there's one guy, it caused chaos in trying to work it out. Really, clearly 3 of them. So there is work to be done. But the information is in massive abundance. And I've said there's over 200 ancient royal gravestones.
Daniel?
Yeah, I'd just like to add that one major sense of agreement that we both have is that Geoffrey of Monmouth was an absolute cad, historically speaking. And yet if you go around to the majority of the museums in Bath and you read or look at any of the plaques about the mythical history, they'll all talk about Geoffrey of Monmouth's account of Bladud and his pigs, and that this was the starting of the whole settlement in Bath. But as Alan's saying, you know, if we're to date this to around 250, there have been Celtic remains that go back 3, 4, 5, 6,000 BC in Bath. So the whole understanding of the age of the city in the academic or mainstream circles is completely out by a good few millennia.
I'll add just one thing. The book Tsarion, the history of Tsarion died in 684, and you can see that that is the work that Geoffrey of Monmouth, or Griffith of Arthur, he's a nephew of Bishop Uxley of Llandaff, right? But you can see where he's got his material, and then he's proceeded to knit it about a bit. The Tsarion's history is still available, and from 684. So there's another source that you could go to quite easily, and a lot of information. So there are sources.
So yeah, I think Alan's point there is really great. There are plenty of older sources, and you don't always have to go through the Catholic line of priests that have written down and changed and adapted history. Sometimes it does take a bit of work to overlay the mythology and to really look around for all of these sources. And I know Michael was talking about this before. It's not as easy as just reading a few accounts. You have to read the mass of material out there, start to pick out some of the similarities and the differences. And also, as Alan was saying, this may be a bit easier in the future with more use of computer programs and things also. So there's a lot to do.
And one last thing. The lives of the saints are plenty of them, and they're very detailed, and all the saints were of the nobility. You couldn't be an ordinary guy and become a saint, but you had to, if a nobleman could, he and his wife. So the sainthood was confined to nobility. So we know who their parents and grandparents were, and they were nearly always linked into the royal clans. Well, they were always. So as you can get all the lives of the saints and what they did in their life, but you also get what king they were associated with, or what nobleman, or who their ancestors were, and that helps you put the history together. And you've also got a very good dating on most of the saints, because their activities within the church. So that's another big source. And
also, of course, if you're looking at any historical work, you have to understand the agenda under which it was written. I come across this time after time working with especially biblical texts, and as I understand from what I've read about Geoffrey, he was no different. He had a political agenda. He had to satisfy his paymaster.
Geoffrey's problem was that the British histories were saying Troy fell 650, and yet he was writing for people who wanted Troy to fall 1200 BC. So he decided he'd better pad it out a bit. And so he took people of various bits and pieces who weren't main, top liners, and he banged them in to fill up that 500-year gap. Because he couldn't get the Trojan, if he said the Trojan War was 650 BC, they said, ridiculous, go and get lost. But he tried to make it look as if the Trojan War fitted in with the prevailing philosophy. And if you see the little stories he tells, you can pick them out from later history and say exactly where they fit.
Okay, a question from the floor, John?
I was just going to say that Daniel keeps using the word Celtic.
Yeah.
And I don't think that actually, people just don't do that anymore, even in academia. And I'm very keen to hear what Alan has to say as well about the use of the word Celtic.
Well, perhaps we can start with Daniel, the justification for the use of Celtic.
Sometimes it's easier to use a term as a reference for a handle for people to understand roughly what you're talking about. And if we're to, I understand your point that sometimes these terms also carry a whole load of baggage with them. And you're right, maybe in this sort of arena it would be best not to bring it into the equation at all. But I know Michael has a lot of thoughts on this subject as well, on the terms that we
but
put
Daniel,
on these people.
can you just explain to the audience who might not be aware why we should not talk about the Celts? Because most people do, so why not?
Well, with the Celtic brand or name, it's been overlaid over the people of the British Isles because of over history, the overlapping cultures which have come from all around Europe, successive waves of people. But generally, the whole culture and all of the social practices of the Celts and the Britons were very, very different. So there's a whole range of difference. I mean, that's just one.
Michael?
I was just going to ask the fellow question, would it be more appropriate or easier if people said Celtic speaking?
Celtic has been used in linguistics, I think has more power. I don't think it has any power whatsoever to explain its British origin. But there is a linguistic link.
Right.
So I find it slightly mysterious.
So that might be the solution then, to sort of, in parentheses then, when you're talking about Celtic people, rather say Celtic speaking people. I mean, I don't make these mistakes. I speak specifically about groups, and never use the term Celtic in any type of context to refer to the megalithic ancestors. But I think it will never go away as a blanket term, so maybe we could modify it by just having Celtic speaking, maybe it would help.
Well, no, the languages are different and the origins can be traced. I think the word Celtic has come in from an archaeological standpoint. The archaeologists, they get something and they create a sort of a standard name for it. So in future, if Britain was destroyed, an archaeologist in 1,000 years' time dug up a Toyota car, he'd say, the Japanese, And so when they found it goes back to the large hoards of metal tools and that were found in the Latine culture thing in Austria. And so they dubbed them Celtic. So when they found a similar sword somewhere else, they said, Celtic. And when they found a bowl or something else somewhere else, they said, Celtic. But none of those people were Celtic. But the material was identifiable as of a culture, you see.
But it was the language of the conquerors as well. Anybody that lived outside the walls of Blinken Rome, right, was suddenly either a barbarian or a Celt.
Yeah.
And
well, I don't think that's true. I mean,
it filters down.
I do a bit of research on that. The Romans
what are you talking about?
They didn't call everybody Celts.
What?
The Romans didn't call everybody Celts.
The Roman historians invented the word and plastered it on Spanish people, irrespective. They weren't privy to these Danube discoveries you're talking about. I'm talking about in their time, in their idiom.
Celt's a Greek word.
Celt's a Greek word. It's not Roman.
They actually took it.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah, but
That's
they knew
the point.
all the different tribes and their names.
Okay, but the thing I was trying to get to is that there is this, when a blanket term is used, it's propagandist, regardless of who invented it and what for, right? It then, yes, right. Yeah. And when you and of course, if they've gone around and suppressed all the indigenous works of the indigenous people, who can refute it? If you can't get to read those works, then you're stuck with whatever the propagandists have said.
Can I just interject at that point? Let me just give you a neutral example to kind of explain how I see this discrepancy. I talked about Gnosticism yesterday and the Gnostics. The Gnostics didn't call themselves the Gnostics, as scholar John Lash points out. They call themselves the Telestai. And the Gnostics, meaning, those who know, was actually a derogatory term put on them by the Romans as a kind of calling them smart asses. So actually the Gnostics were never the Gnostics. The Gnostics were the Telestai, which is a word that means those who are aimed. So this is what happens. We get these blanket terms, but if I go around talking about the Telestai, nobody knows what I'm talking about. So when you get into detail about it, then the etymology, the word, whether it's Greek or whether it's Hebrew or whether it's Latin or this or that or the other, the usage of the word and who uses it, obviously, will remain. So we have to assess both of those things. But as Michael said, that sometimes it's easier just to, rather than offend those who know that actually the story is a little bit different, is just to neutralise that by maybe just putting that linguistic, as you say, parentheses around it.
But there was a term. If you go to the works of Augustus Le Plongeon, there was not only Keltoi, that wasn't Greek or Roman, there was actually tribes that did have a term very similar to Celt. And if you go to Augustus Le Plongeon's works, he even found that far into the Middle East, past Turkey, you have groups called Kalti, or Kati, the Kati and the Kalti, right? And he basically deciphered it as being the men who built in wood. The wood, similar to Phoenicians, but specifically the fences that they put around their domiciles, their villages, that defined them in his interpretation of the etymology. So there's another tie-in there that he says, even besides the Greek and Roman concoction, because remember, maybe they didn't concoct the word, they propagandized the word, but the word may have had its own antiquity quite separate from this palaver that we're talking about. And according to Le Plongeon, it did, and it meant men who built in wood, specifically.
Perhaps as an overview of that point, it's always worth bearing in mind that the original peoples, this is the point that Neil was making, was that the original peoples themselves have a name for themselves, but that name's lost. We don't have those names anymore, and we don't the majority of the time. And so often we do have these hang-on terms which we use in order to get people to reference and think about these areas. But as you say, there's a real problem with doing that too much,
Yes. Of course, a lot of names have been lost to modern usage. The Romans used, the Egyptians used to be known as the Rom. And Egypt was Turti and so on. So there are lots of names that have been lost from history, and lots of names, of course, that have been denigrated, like we call them the Vandals, because they destroy everything. Of course, they were real people, and from our point of view, they destroyed everything. So let's change tack again. Let's go biblical again. This is a question for myself, which actually will probably go out to the panel as well.
Just got to get a train back.
Yeah, Alan's just leaving to catch a train, so. I don't know. It says here, question to myself, do you believe that Jesus was castrated as a Nazarene, or that he possibly had children? You may have caught yesterday that I was saying that obviously Jesus was a Nazarene. He wasn't from Nazareth, that town didn't exist. He was a Nazarene. And the Nazarene were a well-known sect from the 1st century AD, and one of their doctrines was the doctrine of castration, based on the primeval Adam, as they called him. Which I find interesting, because quite independently, before I actually started studying the Nazarene, I had already identified Adam and Eve as being Pharaoh Akhenaten and Nefertiti, because there are so many similarities between the two couples. Adam and Eve lived in their Garden of Eden as two naked sort of lovebirds in this wonderful Garden of Eden. And Akhenaten and Nefertiti lived as two naked lovebirds. They're always naked, they're always displayed as being naked in their wonderful garden of Aten. Aten, Eden. In the Egyptian, it's the same name. So the Garden of Eden was the Garden of Aten, which was Amarna in Middle Egypt, the city of Akhenaten. So what I've been doing here is, and also if you look at the Genesis story, it is actually, in my view, it's a synthesis and a simplification of the hymn to the Aten, the great hymn to the Aten, which was written by Akhenaten himself. But instead of actually detailing a story about the creation of the universe, it was the dawn of a new day. That was what was being described. So coming back to the Nazarene, they believed in the primeval Adam, based on Adam and Eve. And they said the primeval Adam was not only castrated, he was a hermaphrodite. And of course, if you look at the statues of Akhenaten, Pharaoh Akhenaten, he was always displayed as being a sort of hermaphrodite, which is why a lot of people thought he was actually a woman when they first started discovering his statues. So the primeval Adam was supposed to be a castrati, or maybe even a hermaphrodite. And so that was one of the central tenets of Nazarene, which is why, as I said before, Jesus asked his disciples to become eunuchs, as indeed Leo was saying this morning. I think it's Matthew 19:12, isn't it? He asks for his disciples to become eunuchs, to be castrated, and which is why later on, I think it was Herodian wrote about the Nazarene, and we have most of our information from him, and he called them the tosser of testicles. He was slightly denigrating them, of course, because he didn't obviously... This was a big problem in later Christianity. I don't know if you know this, but a lot of the early Christians were actually castrating themselves, and it finally had to be banned. Who banned it? I forget who it was, actually. One of the later Christian fathers actually tried to ban it and successfully banned it. So yes, they were castrated. And the question here is, was Jesus castrated? And yes, I believe so, and for several reasons. But did he have children? Yes, he had children before. Obviously, you know, if you're going to create a long-lasting sect, you're going to want to have children before you get castrated, perhaps. So yes, he did have children. We have several references that refer to the children of Jesus. But was he castrated? Yes. He might have been castrated simply as a follower of his religion, just as Emperor Elagabalus, who I also spoke about yesterday, was also a Nazarene and also castrated himself. He was another tosser of testicles. Yeah. It's not my phrase, it comes from history. But another reason for his being castrated would have been that if he was exiled, as I was trying to explain yesterday, it would not be very wise to exile this new guy, this dangerous rebel, to Great Britain, if he could then procreate a whole new lineage of little Jesuses in his exile. So, perforce, if you were Emperor Vespasian, you would want to castrate him. So he could not do that. He would be the end of his line. And of course, if you link Jesus into the Arthurian legend story, Arthur was very closely linked to the Fisher King, as we've seen before. But the Fisher King was also called the Maimed King. And he was specifically maimed in the genitals. A lot of people have thought this is a reference to circumcision. But I don't think so. I think it's probably actually a reference to castration, either as a Nazarene, as a part of their normal ritual, or as a logical extension of being exiled, that you would have to castrate someone. And the maimed king lost his potency, and his kingdom lost his potency because of his wounds to his genitals. And he had to be cured, but when, I'm trying to think here, if he ever got cured, he would die, or something of this nature. Perhaps someone else can fill me in on the Arthurian legend. But if that refers, of course, to Jesus being in exile, then yes, of course, he would have been castrated. Leo, perhaps you have something else to add on to that?
No, I've nothing to add. That's it.
I'd like to say something. It's about your work on the connections between the Eden story and, the Genesis story and the Akhenaten Nefertiti story. I personally think it's one of your greatest books and recommend it to everyone. It's superlative work, as is all of his work. However, there are prototypes to everything. So thousands and thousands of years before, this Aton cult rose, one of the most important gods, and some would even say the second most important god after Amun-Ra, was Atum-Ra, which many scholars say is the antitype or prototype for Adam, who's Atum, you see. How do you read that? I mean, I know you've just you've spoken entirely and beautifully described the incredible correspondences between Akhenaten's personal life at Amarna and the biblical story, and I'm not doubting that for 1 second. But maybe they were styling themselves even as Atonists, which I know is a stretch for them to identify with any previous cultish thing. But nevertheless, give them maybe allowance that they did. How would you feel about that? Would you?
Yeah, as you say, everything is based on something else. Nothing comes from nothing. And Akhenaten was trying to compress a polytheistic religion into a monotheistic new cult. And Akhenaten was the first monotheist, obviously. That's why I also link him into the Moses story. And if you're going to force polytheism into a monotheist box, you're going to have some bulges somewhere. It's not going to fit in very well. And yes, I think the Atum legend was central. Akhenaten probably didn't like it because it didn't fit his monotheism. But it manifested itself in so many ways later on. So the Atum story, I don't know if you're familiar with Egyptian legend, but Atum was the primal creator god, and he created the universe himself through masturbation. And that was the way the world... Egyptian theology was very sexual, of course. And he ejaculated the universe into, as we understand it now. Later Egyptian dynasties, 18th dynasty onwards, didn't really want Atum having a sole role in doing this. And so they invented the god's wife. And the god's wife role was to masturbate Atum to help him. And so she was called God's hand, or the handmaiden of God, which is the same term, which is exactly the same term that was given to the Virgin Mary, of course. So there were, after that, there was a whole successive line of princesses, because this was a very important role, who became the wife of God. They were known as the wives of God, who effectively married Atum and helped him to ejaculate. But of course, this role, this ritual role, didn't actually involve any sex, so she was always known as the Virgin. And so you can see this, the remnants of this religion coming down into biblical history, because they were all emulating this original Egyptian religion. So Mary and Mary the Virgin and Mary Magdalene were all wives of God, the wife of Atum, but they were also queens of heaven, so they were also emulating Isis in her role as the kingdom of heaven, a queen of heaven, and they were also emulating Isis in their role as God's mother. You remember the famous Madonna and child imagery? Well, that comes exactly and precisely from the Isis and Horus imagery from Egypt.
But do you think also, in terms of the castrati, that the fact that Atum in his primordial form was an androgynous being, that then the Akhenatons and all of these other dignitaries and pharaohs at some point of their life or ritual progress would then try to... Is that, in other words, what I'm saying is, do you think that the origin of the... We know that circumcision began with the Egyptians, was picked up by the Jews. Do you think that the castrati could have come about to emulate, as Akhenaten was all wont to do, the primal androgynous gods?
Possibly, but I think in some senses the castration ritual, not only of Akhenaten but also of the later Nazarene, may have been more from Osiris than from Atum. Because if you remember the story about Osiris was divided up and cast into the four winds of Egypt, and the only thing that was actually missing was his penis. And his penis had to be recreated by Isis, so she could impregnate herself. So again, within the Osiris legend, we have again the missing genitals. And so I think a lot of the Tsarion legend could be mixed in with this, because if you look at the explanations of the Nazarene, it is firmly based in Osirian legend. It talks about Osiris all the time. And of course Jesus was a Nazarene. There's a question at the back there. Well, it doesn't actually say that. The question was, did he have a large harem? Yes, of course, all the pharaohs of Egypt had a large harem, as did King David, King Solomon. King Solomon was supposed to have had 900 wives. Obviously, there is an element of exaggeration here, but they all kept a very large harem. That was pretty normal. And I forget your other point. What was the other point? Was Akhenaten a real person, or was he sort of like an alien or something? Because as you probably all know, Akhenaten looks very strange. He's slightly androgynous. He has this elongated head. He has slight bust. He has very large hips, large thighs. He looks very strange. But we know he didn't look strange because there are busts of him before he went into his full-blown Artanism, which show him as a normal person. And likewise, Nefertiti, who we know was a normal person, one of the most beautiful women perhaps we've ever had, and when she goes into Artanism, suddenly she is portrayed in the same fashion as Akhenaten himself, with the same bodily traits. So we know that that was a stylistic, deliberate stylistic change to make them look like something. Why did they do that? Well, there might be an edge to what you were saying there, in that Akhenaten was trying to portray himself as he understood the gods to be. So that was his image of what the gods looked like, and he wanted to make himself look like the gods. That's why we have around the world all these various cultures deliberately elongating the heads of their children by binding their heads basically when they're growing. And so you find the cone heads all across Central America, China, and the Amarna family were all cone heads. I don't know if you know about this, but Tutankhamun and all of the Amarna children had cone heads. They had been bound, so they bind the heads with bandages as they're growing to make them into cone heads. So they were trying to manipulate their bodies and manipulate the symbology and the artistic styles to make themselves look like the gods, because they thought the gods looked like this. And funnily enough, I don't know if there's a connection here, but I do write about the connection. If you look at the modern alien that always appears on every sci-fi program, they look exactly like Akhenaten, of course. There's a question down here.
Do you find that this ties in well with Samurai Sitchin's work?
Possibly, but I think Michael might be able to answer that better. I don't follow Stitchins quite so much.
Have you read Ralph's work? It's superior in almost every way. That doesn't negate Sitchin's work, you understand? And we keep an open mind. And I mean, I agree with it, with the lady back there, that Akhenaten was alien, but not in the sense that you mean. I mean alien in another way. And secondly, his identification with the gods, that's very specific, gods. I can give that lady a long list of books, very academic works written by women on the subject of the Atenist dynasties and Akhenaten, and they have concluded, the most recent research concludes, that the pictorialization of him with the womb was not a celebration of womankind. It was to adopt her traits as a male, to say that we, just like you pointed out about the other Looney Tune people that, you know, want to adopt the masculine, the feminine traits of the female, or again, push them artificially down in order for you to feel artificially high. Something of the same kind was going on when he addressed the artists and basically commissioned them to paint him and his wife in this fashion. It was to defeminize himself. I mean, to feminize himself, but to defeminize the woman. In other words, he thought of himself, he was a megalomaniac, and thought of himself as a god who had the power also then to give birth. And that is what, and that's not my theories, this is what the latest theories are, that this megalomaniac was then in some strange way identifying so much with the androgynous gods that he even wanted to adopt, you see, in some sort of psychopathic way, the traits of the life-giving female. And I agree with those theories. After years of research myself, I think those are very, very accurate and do explain that kind of artwork.
And also, perhaps I might add, and I'm just thinking off the cuff here, I've not actually written about this, the whole of Egyptian theology was dualist. Black, white, sun, moon, male, female, north of Egypt, south of Egypt. Everything was dualist. But Akhenaten wanted monotheism. So how do you have a monotheist, dualist sexuality? Well, you end up with a primeval Adam, and the primeval Adam was supposed to be a hermaphrodite, so a union of the male and female. So he was usurping, in some senses, the dualist theology of Egypt. Yep, question at there. Can you make it short, please? Okay, so the question, can I hold you there? The question is, why was Jesus very important based on his astrological symbolism? So we're jumping into another era here. It's not really part of what we're discussing. Does anyone have any thoughts on Akhenaten before we move on?
Oh, no.
Okay. Well, let's move on then to the first century. Why was he important? Well, because at that era, the most important thing that always happened in history was the start of the new processional month. So, and again, perhaps I ought to explain procession very quickly. Every 2,150 years, roughly, the stars turn because of the precession of the equinox, and we get a new constellation. So we had the change between Taurus and Aries happened in about 1800 BC. And so the worship of the Apis bull in Egypt turned into the worship of the sheep. And we had the Hyksos or the Hyksos, the shepherd kings of Egypt. Why were they shepherds? Because Taurus had turned into Aries. That is why all of the biblical patriarchs were always called shepherds. It's nothing to do with keeping sheep. It's all about Aries. And then there's this big discussion between the sons of Joseph and the Pharaoh. They go to see Pharaoh, and paraphrased, he says something like to his sons, "Don't tell Pharaoh that you are keepers of bulls. Tell them that you are shepherds." Don't tell them that you are shepherds. That's right. Don't tell them you are shepherds, because shepherds are hated. Say that you are keepers of bulls. Why is he saying that? It's got nothing to do with agriculture. It's because the shepherd kings, the Hyksos, have been thrown out of Egypt, not very many generations before that. And so the Hyksos shepherd kings were the abomination. That's why they hated shepherds. It was nothing to do with agriculture. It was because of a civil war between the shepherds and the bull worshippers. So it's all to do with astrology. And then we move on, and of course, that is why Alexander the Great always wore the horns of the ram in his hair, because he was a king of Aries. But then we came to the end of Aries, which happened in about AD 10-ish, roughly. That was the end of that great month, and the start of a new great month, and Aries turned into Pisces. And that is why Jesus was born, as I said before, as a Lamb of God, but became a fisher of men, because of this change in the processional month. So that is why he was important. He was the first king of the new processional month, the first king of Pisces. And that's why we have this great line of the fisher kings from Arthurian legend. And that's why the Pope wears the cap of the fish on his head. If you've ever thought about the Pope's headgear, it's the mouth of a fish. And that's why the Pope always wears the fisher ring. That's why the symbol of Christianity is the fish. It's all to do with the processional month of Pisces. So that's why, apart from the fact that Jesus was so incredibly well connected to all of the major empires of that first century era, as I pointed out, but he was also the first king of the sign of Pisces. But of course the sign of Pisces will be ending shortly. This is probably why you have these Mayan prophecies of 2012 and so on. I think it's all based on the same end of the processional era, basically. But I don't think it's going to end in 2012, because if you look at the constellations and where the join between Pisces and Aquarius is, to me, it looks about 2250 or maybe 2300 AD is when Pisces will end and Aquarius will begin. So at that time there will be a new processional month. There will be a new era. They will be looking for a new sign for the new era, and there will be a new president, a new king of the sign of Aquarius.
He was asking what gives, I suppose you were just trying to talk about Jesus of Gamala, right?
It's like Jesus' story is essentially the same story as
Yeah, but
every other major religion. What makes him worthy of
because ritually, I mean, you can be biologically king, you can have all the other rights to be a king, you can be intelligent, you can be warlike. That didn't mean as much in those days. That was important, but the backstory of all divinity, kingship or other, was the story of the stars. And it is, after all, a circle, so it will repeat. So the recurrence that you keep talking about is probably because the thing was a circle, and you have the ages and months returning, and then you have many cycles within that. But all these dignities, Mithras was shown, in the same aspects as Jesus, even inside the Vesica Pisces, in fact. So was Sol and Victi and so many others, Horus and so on. So the recurrency is because it's not about prototypes, stereotypes I mean, it's about archetypes. And it was very important that the individual stereotypical person, as it still is today with the royals today, very much so, that they have to sort of emulate. They become simulacras, they become emulations of the cosmic story or archetypal story. So it's not just Jesus of Gamala, the physical individual. He was honor bound to walk through these particular ritualistic stages. Akhenaten did, even though he flaunted a good number of them, but he still had to adhere to others, and so forth and so on. And so it has continued all down the way. And from the Pope's gear, as you're saying, and all the different regalia that they wear. Never forget that the most ancient backstory, going back way before any recorded history, is the story of the zodiac and the story of the stars. It will always be found wherever you look. It will always be there, implicit in every idiom of history and every idiom of divinity and royalty and biblical, and religion, basically.
And you've got to remember, of course, that these people were of the bloodline. The bloodline was hugely important. That's why all of the pharaohs of Egypt married into the family. They married their daughters, they married their sisters. As did Akhenaten, of course, as did all the Ptolemaic pharaohs of Egypt. And so if Jesus of Gamala was of the bloodline, then of course he would be a very important character. And especially if he had picked up the bloodline of the Persian line as well as the Egyptian line. And the bloodline was important, it still is important, because these, especially in that era, you would be considered to have the blood of the gods in you. That's why they were blue-blooded. They were supposed to be slightly different. These were the people of the gods, the bloodline of the gods. So, yeah, of course, Jesus of Gamala would be hugely important if he could prove his ancestry. And that's the important bit.
No way. I wrote a book and did a DVD on it. You're going to have to go there. No, wait a minute. Let's start at A. In the beginning. Once upon a time. Oh, no, there's no Ireland today. The Irish, or the Aria that I'm talking about is, it's just a name today that's plastered on a topographical place. It's not to do with the real Ireland that I speak of, which was a worldwide college of elite druids, not the Irish bumpkins, who in every age have just been as dumb as everybody else. In our work, we always address the shamanic core. Even if I'm talking about Native American Indians or whatever, the ones who are the keepers of the knowledge, be they atonist, amonist, I don't care what. We're only addressing that intelligent core of individuals. And remember, there's many arguments that when you speak in history that we do, they'll go, oh, you're quite wrong about individualism. All the tribes of the past were heavily collectivized. What are you talking about? What's this palaver about individualism? And that's not true. The general rank and file have always been collective, that's true, going back even into some very advanced tribes. And there's an awful lot of disinformation that we're given about Native American tribes and so forth. They're all bloodthirsty murderers as well. There's nothing, we shouldn't have that romanticism that Alan was talking about. What we are addressing is this individual, unique, turned-on individual who is in every situation, in every culture, going to strive for that level of independence, either by bonding by nature or in some other way, right? And the same thing goes for the Irish. So the real meaning of the word Arya had nothing to do with caste, nothing to do with color, nothing to do with race, and nothing to do with color. It had to do with caste, spiritual caste. And that meant a man, a pygmy in Africa, could be an Arya, right? Somebody from China, somebody from Timbuktu. It was irrespective because it had to do with spiritual matriculation, emotional intelligence, and divine understanding is what made the Arya. So when I use that word, it's only in a secondary and tertiary way that I'm even speaking about the so-called green emerald owl, which I just happen to be from. The theory and the research is of a much, more specific and ultimately, fundamental rendering of that word, which is why the propaganda to destroy the meaning of the word Aryan, as we should all know by now, there was a tremendous work done to make sure that the real meaning of that word was destroyed. But to try and go into the whole thesis is absolutely impossible. I just refer people to the website, there's a lot of good free material there, and to the books themselves, absolutely. Yeah.
And Leo, I think you had a point to make.
But just a 1-minute fantasy. AD 200 years, 250 years, AD 2210. Let us just suppose that the world has been through all sorts of weird and wonderful cataclysms. The West has fallen apart. There's a new empire. The women of the world, this is the best bit, have got so fed up with the man gods and with the man Illuminati and the man structures, they've thrown us out. And the women have united. And the women, like any uniting, you need to unite around something. So you've united women around the goddess Diana and the great stories of the goddess Diana. Then somebody comes along and chips in with some stuff from Princess Diana. And somehow the two stories get all mixed up. And so Princess Diana, the goddess Diana, she really was, she came to Earth and incarnated, and she did all sorts of wonderful things and went through an archetypal story, and then she was taken by the remnant of the Illuminati, and she was taken deep down into the earth, and she was ritually murdered. A new story for a new age. Ho.
How mythology can be manufactured, yes. I mean, that's how mythology is made, isn't it? Any other points on Akhenaten before we move on? We've only got about 5 minutes left, by the way. Any other points on Akhenaten and Eden? Yes, sir? Yes, they often say he had a particular, I think it's Crohn's disease or something of that nature. Frolics disease, yes, something of that nature. But no, as I said before, we have statues, imagery of him before he got into Artanism, which show him as a normal person. He was slightly large-featured, perhaps, even in his early work. But by no means was he odd-looking. And again, Nefertiti, we know she was a normal individual, and yet she too is shown in the same Artanist fashion. Yeah, so it was a style.
A quick point on that. A lot of people say that the closest kind of image we have of Akhenaten today is Barack Obama, who is also known as Barakhenaten.
I've not heard of that one. So yes, there was a particular style for a political reason, because no sculptor in Egypt would dare to show a pharaoh in such a hideous fashion if it was not sanctioned at the absolute highest level by Akhenaten himself. So this was a deliberate symbolism that he wanted to employ to show some specific message. And the question is, what was that message that he was trying to put across? I think it was that he was trying to portray himself in the image of the gods. That's the only possible reason, in my view. So we've dealt with that one. Here's one that's is sort of for... Okay, this is sort of for Michael and for myself. It's actually addressed to Michael, so I'll read it to him then. Considering the Jesus King Arthur correlation that's been made by Ralph, can you talk about the implication of this in terms of British history? What difference would it make if Jesus was the archetype of Arthur?
I don't know. It's hard to say. I think I'm thinking in broader terms. My interest is more of the when I think of Ralph's work, I'm thinking of the 7 other books he did. You know, this is just one of the end of a massive thesis that he's been working on. I might have to give that some thought. Of course, it will matter a lot. I mean, my own understandings of the Arthurian legend, which are rooted in megalithic Irish mythology, obviously modify, and that's healthy, that's good. It keeps us out of that rigidity of, you know, being declarative and what you think you know. But unless the question was phrased in another way, I really couldn't say. I think it has great monumental importance, but I'm thinking of that would change the world. I'm thinking about St. Paul, I'm thinking about the crimes. My mind is entirely preoccupied with what you were saying, Leo, earlier on about one chink in the armor of this, one new revelation, of which there will be many more. It just makes you wonder what has been done in the name of this preposterous lunacy. It makes you weep. It makes me weep. I take this very seriously. And I think very deeply about the crimes that have been done in the name of this palaver and this nonsense, you see. So I'm looking at that. I think if these revelations from Ralph or anybody else can insist in any way to the healing of what has been done, because we carry within our race memory, you see, the scars of every human being that's lived on this planet and everything they've had to endure. It's right in you. It's just that we have a circuitry that blocks that. It's called the ego, and we should thank the ego for that ability, because we'd be drowned in sorrow if we had to face what has gone on. And I hope that Leo's talk has, for people who may be new to this, and if you get his book and you'll see what the horrors that have been done in this, never forget that. Because we are the harbingers, we are the descendants of those people who cried in the mines and the factories and the fields. Why? Each individual here carries that weight, because your ancestors died miserable deaths, children in the mines not far away from here, right? On the fields of war, for instance. And in their psyche they asked why? And you are to provide the answer. So even if there's not a humanitarian shred in anybody sitting here, and I hope there is, but just imagine for a moment that you have no real concern about other human beings. Have at least concern then for your own lineage, your own heredity, your own past, and the forefathers, the uncles, and the ancestors, and the grandparents who died hideous deaths for nothing in wars to keep these tyrants in their place. And the answers that you discover in this life, you're answering their call. So never forget that.
And just to add to that, I don't think it would affect British history at all, but I'd like to sort of take it out on a little bit of a tangent and say that the Church of Jesus was supposed to be Gnostic. It was supposed to be, and we can interpret Gnosticism as scientia, science. So it was supposed to be welcoming to science, looking to the future. That's why Jesus was using Hero of Alexandria as one of his court magi, because he understood the importance of people like Hero, who was a sort of Leonardo da Vinci of the 1st century AD. He was using people like that to further science, because his religion was looking out towards science, astrology, mathematics, the stars. But he failed, of course. He failed in establishing his religion, and it was taken over by Christianity and the Catholic Church, which stifled all of research, all of science for 1500 years until the Reformation. And I just made a speculation in one of my books that if he had actually succeeded and taken over the levers of power in Rome and become Emperor of Rome, and if Hero of Alexandria had been made the court scientist back in the 1st century AD, we could well have had aircraft built in the 2nd century AD. We could well have had rockets going to the moon in the 3rd and 4th century AD. We have lost out on 1500 years of advancement because of what happened in the 1st century AD. So the decisions we make, the leaders we choose, make a great difference to what happens to the future.
Cost us 1,500 years minimum.
Yes, cost us 1,500. Okay, I think we're coming to the end of the panel session. I hope you have enjoyed it. There will be a break, and if I just quickly look at the program, we're having a break now till 3:45. It says when Neil Haig comes on, so we've got 15 minutes. Let's call it 3:50, and we'll be back with Neil Haig, The Rise of the True Human Being, Keys to Unlocking the Imagination Through Untold History of Art. Hope you've enjoyed the panel discussion.